Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Thanks for joining us. I think today is not just a hot topic. What will the Biden administration do here in Asia and ASEAN? I think the particular interests are two speakers. I'm also very privileged to host and speak at other conferences. But frankly, on America and Asia, there are few people I really gather a lot of insights from, and two of them are here today. Bilahari Kausikan is famous or notorious throughout the whole region, depending how you look at it, as Singapore's undiplomatic diplomat. I myself think he's one of the sharpest minds we have. I'm delighted that he's here to share with us his thoughts about the US in our region. But equally, it's been my pleasure to really know Frank Lavin, Ambassador Lavin, since he was our US ambassador here in Singapore. And his team, I still remember, made him a t-shirt that said, brutally frank. He's mellowed over the years, last time I've talked to him, but I think his sharpness of insights still remains. So really, I'm glad you're all here. And the time we have, I better pass it over straight away to our speakers. I promise you, though, that no matter how candid and lively they get, it won't be like Trump Biden #1. Frank, would you like to start us off, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. And I'm delighted to be here today. I'll say greetings to the audience and members of the Diplomatic Corps. Thank you for joining us today. And it's good to be on a podium with Bilahari again as well. And I hope to be able to learn and share some thoughts for you about what the new administration means for relationship with ASEAN and Asia in general. Look, I might not take up whole 10 minutes. I think I make remarks, but just to set the table, I think there's three important bits of good news in the change of administration for U.S. engagement in ASEAN and Asia, and I think there's two question marks, or two incomplete marks, I should say. So three strong L's and two we don't know yet. And let me just go through that. One, the most important change, the most important bit of good news, I think, is a change in tone. That Joe Biden it comes from sort of a classical school of politics about don't use public debate as a political device. Don't criticize other countries for domestic political audiences. Don't inflame issues for political advantage. So I think you'll see a more subdued, more business-like tone in conduct from the Biden administration. I think that'll be enormously helpful with all of the issues and problems we have, just to not be adding to it gratuitously. So that's the first point. Second point is behaviorally or philosophically, he is a strong believer in the multilateral process. All right. So Trump administration is very much characterized by unilateralism, assertion of U.S. goals. But I think Biden would say, well, he's no less supportive of U.S. goals, but traditionally the most effective way of achieving goals is to do so in some kind of collaborative process. You do this not out of naivete, but out of the fact that you have a more sustainable end result if you have buy-in from like-minded nations. So multilateralism is a preferred mechanism rather than unilateralism. So change in tone, rebirth, the re-energy of multilateralism. In fact, I'm talking to some people on the Biden team before the elections. My comment was the first 3 to 6 months of a Biden presidency, that whole leadership strata's got to have their frequent flyer miles in use, because you're going to have the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, Vice President, maybe the president once or something, but you're going to have them out and about meeting with friends, allies, colleagues, collaborators, worthy interlocutors, just to re-energize, reset, redefine the relationship. The third positive point I would note too is this is more bipartisan. So this certainly took place under Trump, and I think it accelerates under Biden, is ongoing emphasis on Asia, ongoing importance of Asia, that although there are problems and challenges around the world, the part of the world that is in the process of where international relationships are being defined is Asia Pacific region. So it requires just more weight, more attention, more interaction from the United States. Now, those are the three bits of good news. Let me then give two words of caution. One of which, and we see this sometimes in ASEAN, when you have an emphasis on multilateralism, you sometimes end up with a confusion of ends and means. You sometimes have people believe that the multilateral process in itself was the end, was the goal. So we established the ASEAN Tourism Ministerial, and we attend the ASEAN Tourism Ministerial, and you say, but what the hell came out of the ASEAN Tourism Ministerial? Did we move all of ASEAN tourism paperwork to electronic interface? Did we standardize it all? Did we move to open skies? Did we do anything to help ASEAN tourism, or did we just have a good meeting? So you can have a confusion of ends and means, and you have a lot of self-congratulatory political culture about the fact that we had a meeting, right? So there is a danger, there is a risk that people just meet. The second one is to say the core challenges don't go away just because you might have an improved process for dealing with the core challenges. So core geopolitical issues that were emerging over the last 5 or 10 years are still the geopolitical issues of today, whether you believe in unilateral approach or multilateral approach. So we don't yet have a sense of how Biden intends to deal with these core challenges. I'll say this, though, the political atmosphere in the United States has, I think, evolved sharply in the last 4 years. I mean, international politics. That if we asked people, just to take one example, if we asked people 4 years ago what they thought about China's role in the region, I think you would receive a guarded approach, a guarded response, maybe a neutral response. That China is still defining its role in the region. It has to be seen. There's no need, or we'd not automatically assume that it's hostile or aggressive. I think that's what you might hear 4 or 5 years ago. I think if you ask that question in Washington today, I think you find enormous skepticism about China's role in the region, and enormous, almost hostility in Washington across the political spectrum. So there's been a quite sharp deterioration in America's view of China and China's role in the region in the last 4 years. Now, that doesn't spell out an answer about what Biden's response would be and how he might want to engage China and what does he think about TPP. And as I think we all know, that US political campaigns are not the best forum for articulation of a policy. But what I'd say is we still have the same fundamental geopolitical issues today that we had yesterday. And any president is tested. Every president is tested. Events test you, circumstances test you, foreign powers test you. Something will happen. It might be a clever test, a fair test. It might be what you might call an unfair test. But there will be moments where it could be North Korea, it could be Putin, it could be anybody. But the point is, there will be moments where you are challenged, you view the status quo as challenged, and we don't have a sense yet of how Biden responds to the test. So what I would encourage Washington watchers to do, because this is where I think his cabinet selections will be absolutely critical. So who he picks for Secretary of State and who he picks for Secretary of Defense. And there's enormous talent out there, but we just don't have the individuals yet at this point. But I think that will be the earliest tell, and we'll know in the next few weeks how he's shaping up his team, right? So that's my overview, Mr. Chairman. I'd be delighted to turn it over to Bilahari for his thoughts.
Thank you very much for getting us off. Bilahari, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Thanks, Frank, for that presentation. I find myself, and I say this sincerely, agreeing with everything Frank said. So I'm tempted to say goodbye now and go and have a beer or something, but it's a bit early for having a beer. So let me just offer some comments as a supplement to what Frank said, because I really agree with everything he said. Maybe a bit more emphasis on certain points that Frank has already put out. First, I think Mr. Biden will not come to the White House with an entirely free pair of hands. He has a divided party, he has a divided country, right? All these challenges that are going on in Georgia, everywhere else, these are just a waste of time and noise. He is the president, but he's not going to be a president with a completely free hand. Don't forget, there are 71 million plus Americans who apparently didn't want him to be president. Secondly, he has said so, and I think it bears emphasis. Don't expect him to be rushing on a plane to get to the next ASEAN meeting, because his emphasis is going to be domestic. it must be domestic. He has to look at the economy, he has to look at the political divisions, but first of all, the economy. In fact, I'll be rather worried if he was eager to come and visit ASEAN. Therefore, as Frank said, who he appoints as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor will be more than usually important. Always important, but more than usually. Secondly, I think he is going to fine-tune rather than fundamentally change direction on the big issues, on China, on trade. He is a veteran member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He knows this stuff. So he will bring more order into the process of decision-making. He will bring more discipline in the process of communicating decisions. He will bring more civility to relations with friends and allies, but not necessarily change direction. Even with friends and allies, for example, it's been an American goal since the end of the Cold War to get Europe to take up more of the burden of the common defense, right? And I think that will still be a goal, but he will put forward that goal in a much more polite and traditional way. Second, I think Mr. Biden was Mr. Obama's vice president. So he therefore cannot avoid responsibility for the bad things that happened on Obama's watch, as well as take credit for the good things, right? It's not fair, but who says life is fair? We should not idealize pre-Trump foreign policy. There were great strengths in Obama's foreign policy. It was pleasing to hear him talk about a pivot to Asia. It was flattering that he took the time to come to ASEAN meetings, and the opening to Myanmar and the TPP were substantive achievements. But not everything was good. It was clear, particularly in the second Obama administration, that he was reluctant to use power, hard power, I mean. Obama had a lot of soft power. He had it oozing out of his ears. But soft power needs to be stiffened with hard power. And by his actions or inactions in the South China Sea, he may have conveyed an impression, which is not a wrong impression, that he was reluctant to use hard power. So, fairly or not, President Biden every action is going to be scrutinized by friend and foe alike for any sign of weakness. As I said, Biden is a foreign policy veteran. He will bring more order, more calm to the process of foreign policy, and that's all good. But if he is regarded, rightly or wrongly, as being reluctant, as his president was during the Obama administration, to use hard power, then it will be all for naught, because almost all of the most dangerous and important geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific are hard power issues, whether it's the South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, Himalayas, Senkaku. These are hard power issues. Soft power alone don't cut it. The exception is trade. But there, I think Frank knows this much better than I. I think he's not going to change direction abruptly. He will fine-tune things rather than change direction. One last point. I think at least the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and certain members of the foreign policy establishment are going to press a Biden administration to make up for what they regard as Trump's indifference to values, American values. And I think he ought to place some emphasis on it, but he should approach this issue with caution. Not all American friends and allies, even not all friends and allies, do not share all American values or the definition of American values, or place the same emphasis on different values. And that's true, in fact, of the 70-odd million Americans who obviously have a different set of values or different interpretation of values who voted for Trump. It is not a strategic asset. And there is no more issue important than US-China relations, and that's a strategic issue. And values is part of the equation in a strategic competition, but it cannot be allowed to overwhelm the entire equation, particularly in Southeast Asia. Final point. We have talked a lot about the failures of American foreign policy under Donald Trump. We don't talk enough about the failures of Chinese foreign policy under President Xi Jinping. If there is a nascent coalition of countries across the world, including countries in our own region, with concerns about China, it is not due to American foreign policy's success, but Chinese foreign policy failures. That is something that Mr. Biden can build on. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Bilahari and Frank. I think that's a very good start, and some questions were bound to come in. But let me start us off. You've both mentioned a bit about hard power and not being soft. I think Frank said that there's no sort of rolling back. The perceptions of China have changed. I think Bilahari put it very well too, that Obama, towards the second term, was reluctant to really hold the ground, particularly on certain hard power issues. In that space, in these last few years, despite Trump's sort of more aggressive approach, China has made its stance clear. What should the Biden administration start to do about these hard power issues? May I ask specifically about the Indo-Pacific idea and the Quad relations with the Japanese, the Australians, and the Indians seem to have been warmed up by the Trump administration in the last year or so. Would this continue? Would this emphasis on more hard power alliances with the democratic and more sort of assertive powers be on the Biden agenda? Can I ask Frank first, perhaps? Frank, you're muted, Frank. Frank, your microphone's off.
Apologies. Thank you, Simon. I was saying certainly yes. I think the Quad is viewed in early days as a successful device. It's not clear how far it can go, how robust it can go, but it's viewed as a mechanism that has utility to it, and the utility of which can be improved and enhanced. So I think there's more to be said about the Quad. I think Bilahari is right that the TPP is out there, but U.S. presidential campaigns are the least fruitful mechanisms in which to discuss trade policy, because there's just half the countries against you anyhow. So don't bring it up at all. So Biden wisely did not bring it up at all, but we just don't know. We just don't know what his appetite is, and I think it's not so much a question of political cost to get TPP in, because I think he can do it. There's enough concern about China. There's enough rejection of Trump protectionism. There's enough sort of nostalgia for Obama. I don't think it's an overwhelming reach to get TPP through, but it's a question of management, bandwidth, and priorities for the first 6 months. Because if we are sitting down with President Biden 12 months into his presidency and said, how did that first year go? What happened in the first year? What did you do? 90% of that answer will be the US economy and the pandemic, right? He has to get those two things right. Everything else is 10%. So what we're really saying is, among that 10%, by the way, would you mind TPP? I mean, maybe yes, maybe no is the point. It's just a question of management bandwidth. I think it'll be a fair question to ask 6 months into the presidency. Now, do you think maybe in 2022 you can bring it back? You can start that conversation. So, but I don't see it in the first few months, just too much opportunity cost. And I'll say one other, maybe this is already ongoing because I've been out of government for a while, but I'd say when you have these odd moments like the border clash between China and India, that to my mind, I was talking to a friend in Australian government and I said, I have no idea what your consultations are in Delhi. You've got regularized meetings. I said, this is the time to show up with a senior fellow with your satellite images. And this is time to say, here's what we see, here's what we know, here's our take. And they value that connectivity when there's sort of a moment of crisis, right? So I would tell the Americans, same thing I tell the Japanese, the same thing, that show up when you need to show up. And that's part of enhancing the value of the Quad.
Thank you. Before we go back to Bilahari, you mentioned trade issues and TPP in particular, Frank. At the ASEAN summit coming up, we expect a movement on the RCEP. I mean, without India, but the rest of RCEP. On the trade issues, though you've said Biden will have to take his time to come back to the issues, what would you think his advisors should be telling him about RCEP, if anything?
I think the core message he's going to hear from Asia is the region is not standing still. China is not standing still. The US can ill behoove to stand still. So you've got to come up with an affirmative agenda or you're going to be losing out. You're going to be marginalized by events moving faster than you. And by the way, my guess is he's there. He accepts this point. But messaging it to a broader US political constituency would be helpful.
Thanks, Frank. Bilahari, over to you. How about the Quad and the hard power issues?
Well, look, as I said, all the most dangerous issues in Asia, from the Himalayas to Senkaku, with the South China Sea and Taiwan Straits in between, are hard power issues, right? The only exception are the trade issues, which has a hard power dimension. But where is the Quad going? Where is the Quad going? The Quad is a reflection of these global concerns about certain aspects of Chinese behavior. Now, not all members of the Quad have exactly the same concerns, and not all members of the Quad hold those concerns with the same degree of intensity, but they all have this common framework. So how it will evolve really depends on how Chinese behavior evolves or does not. That's my first point. Secondly, I think the Quad itself, or the idea of the Indo-Pacific, which is closely linked, has evolved considerably. Sitting out of government, but I look at it, I think the most attractive ideas of the Quad or the Indo-Pacific are those put forward by Japan and Australia, which has a large economic dimension in them, right? The kind of idea put out by Pompeo, nobody will play, not even a US ally like Japan, right? So the point is, I think, as Frank said, there are a lot of foreign policy, national security talent at the disposal of the Biden administration. How he chooses to use it, we have to wait and see, but the talent is there. And they know one thing, that this is not binary, not in the Indo-Pacific. It's not binary. Nobody in the Indo-Pacific, even the closest American ally like Japan, looks at that competition as a binary choice. One last point, and this is where perhaps Mr. Pompeo people like Mr. Pompeo willfully did not want to understand. When we say we do not want to choose, and everybody has said the same thing in different ways, what do we mean? We don't mean that we just want to lay low, say nothing, and hope not to be noticed by other people. What we mean is that we want to be able to choose our own alignments according to our interests on different issues. And we don't see any need to align ourselves across the entire spectrum of issues in any one direction. We want autonomy. This is something I think any US administration should bear in mind, because there is, and this is not peculiar to Mr. Trump, it has been historically a very strong tendency in US foreign policy, particularly in Southeast Asia, to look at things in binary terms. If you are not free, you must be red. If democracy is not advancing, it must be in retreat. And if ASEAN doesn't wholeheartedly embrace America, it must be falling into China's clutches. You know this, Simon, you know this, Frank. This is simply not true.
And as you said earlier, Bilahari, other writing, you believe in the multilateral approach. And as you said very clearly now, it's certain choices on certain issues rather than a sort of war and a permanent alliance sort of idea. So I think those were good points.
Anyway, multilateralism, as Frank said, is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. It's an appropriate instrument in some issues. It may not be appropriate in other issues.
Good.
Simon, if I may, I like Bilahari's comment. I would also offer the same advice to Asia. I'd also offer the same advice to Washington, D.C., meaning even if you're concerned about some activities of China, it would be wrong, it would be to the detriment of the US to be dogmatically hostile to China. And what you need to do as part of a multifaceted foreign policy is try to find what areas of convergence you can find and what areas of cooperation you can find. And there certainly are those areas, but that actually makes your complaints more legitimate, if you will, more powerful, meaning don't demonize or just radiate animosity toward China, but try to find some positive common ground as well.
Great. In fact, if I could pull out on that, I've got questions coming up about human rights and democracy and also about things like Iran and North Korea. Before we get there, I wanted to pull out a bit more from Frank Lavin about that cooperation with China. You know China very well, Frank. After leaving us, you went up there to really engage China at the business level, etc. Could there be possibly within the first, say, 2 years, areas of cooperation between the Biden administration and China without seeming soft on China? What areas would that be? Would it be more like the WHO, the WTO, or what could we imagine?
Well, there have been historically, Simon, and so I'd say just don't throw that in the trash can. I mean, be pragmatic about it. There have even been episodic cooperation in North Korea because at times there's convergence of views in North Korea that we don't want things to completely melt down or collapse, right? Although there's certainly divergences regarding North Korea as well. And there was cooperation on the Paris Climate Accords, right? Which isn't the meatiest of accords, but at least both countries were sort of pulling the same way. So I think you can get back to some of these easily enough. U.S. will re-enter the WHO. U.S. will re-enter the Paris Climate Accords. So there's going to be some, and there's a fair amount of positive trade activity, a fair amount of positive educational activities taking place. So there's a reasonable basis for some positive conversations there. My concern at the moment is not the set of issues we have, the set of problems we have. The set of problems we have are kind of the typical problems. What's odd, what's distinctive about the moment is not the number of problems. What's distinctive about the moment is that there is not one voice seemingly in Beijing or in Washington that is positive about the need for a stable relationship or the utility or value in some kind of a stable relationship. So nobody's making this point, which I think is cumulatively corrosive to the bilateral relationship. If my message to you is nothing but negative, and your message back to me is nothing but negative, then watch out. We're on a downhill slope, and it just gets worse and worse.
Simon, can I make one point to reinforce what Frank said just and earlier about cooperation with China and not projecting unremitting hostility across the entire spectrum of issues? Look, it is not unusual. In fact, it is much more normal for cooperation and competition to coexist in major power relations. That's the normal state of affairs. So stand firm and even push back when you must, but cooperate when you can. Yeah. But one thing I want to emphasize, one of the mistakes I think made by the second Obama administration, they thought they had to de-emphasize competition in order to secure China's cooperation on issues like climate change, right? And that's a mistake. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of international relations because states cooperate not as favors to each other, but because it's in their interest to do so. And if it's in Beijing's interest to cooperate on the environment and climate change, and I think it is, they will. And if it's not in their interest, no matter what inducements you do, you give them, they won't. Simple as that. Something very straightforward, but was, I think, overlooked deliberately otherwise in the second Obama administration. It should be kept firmly in mind as we go forward with the Biden administration.
We're receiving a lot of questions and comments in our two boxes, Q&A and chat. I'm not going to read them all out, but I'll try to get to the heart of them and pick up from where Bilahari just left off. This idea of cooperation but competition, to what degree, particularly on trade, will it extend to the possibility that the call to sort of reshore, take supply chains out of China deliberately, would that lessen, would the economic win-win come back to some degree, except of course maybe for clearly security issues? And on Bilahari's other point earlier about the human rights and democracy part, would there be some points to watch out for, Frank? What do you think?
On the first question on reshoring or migration, I think we're seeing almost no active departures from China because of political risk. But we are seeing people rebalancing new investment, I think, quite clearly. So you might not take such a negative view of China. You're saying I have to actually formally exit the market, but I'm actually going to abandon facilities. But what people are saying, I think, is here on out, we have to factor concentration risk and political risk into our calculus, and we cannot simply, even if we're fully satisfied with our production facilitate our supply chain in China. We cannot simply replicate this. We have to move something to South Asia or move something to Vietnam or elsewhere. So I think that is unfolding. Naturally, people are very quiet about it, right? Because you should never say to an important market where we have these concerns. But I think it's unfolding. It's unfolding. The second question was what, Simon? Sorry.
Well, human rights and democracy part. I mean, do you agree with Bilahari that in a way there are some cautions about pushing that too hard with other Asians?
Sure. I'll say this. I don't think Biden has really spelled out what he intends to do. But, you know, it's human rights always struck me as something equivalent to fire, a flaming torch. You can use it constructively, you can use it destructively. So be intelligent how and where you apply it. And, you know, my political pedigree started in the Reagan administration, and part of the enormous success of taking this forward was he was able to fuse geopolitical goals of pushing back against the Soviets with also using human rights as a offensive weapon against them as well. So he's able to stigmatize them as well as push them. So it was well done. It was well done. But you know, horses for courses. You need to be smart about where and how you apply this. And I couldn't predict what Biden intends to do.
Okay, I think that's fair. It's very early on, you know, to say. Bilahari, earlier on, you also indicated that sometimes it's partly China's foreign policy mistakes or failures. Would you think of any particular ways in which the Biden administration could gain ground, in a sense, with other Asians to seize on some of these mistakes?
I would say the obvious one. Many people have said it because it's so obvious. There is a nascent coalition of countries with concerns about aspects of Chinese behavior. In fact, I can't think of a single major economy that doesn't have some concerns. Right? So there you have a potential coalition, and most of them are your allies anyway. So you just have to work the process in a more traditional way, because you are going to be pushing on an open door. There is another issue which is much more pertinent to Southeast Asia. Traditionally, the United States has paid a lot of attention, rightly so for the obvious reasons, to the sea in Southeast Asia, South China Sea, Senkaku, and so on. But don't forget, the land is as important as the sea. The Mekong issues are extremely important to at least half of ASEAN, and crucially important to Cambodia and Laos, which are really very largely still subsistence agriculture, and it's existential to them, right? In a way, it is not quite existential to Thailand or Vietnam because they have more differentiated economies. But no, Southeast Asia here is not alone. You know, there are 17 countries in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and in Central Asia whose major rivers originate in China. And they too have very similar concerns about the consequences of damming up the upper reaches of these things. Here you have an issue which potentially can be a pressure point, could potentially can be an area of cooperation with China if China is inclined to cooperate. Right? So there are things that can be done. And there's quite a lot that can be done. It doesn't mean that you have to, you know, and as I said, let me repeat this thing. I think one of the serious mistakes of the Obama administration in its second iteration was this idea, two ideas. One is that your adversary or your competitor or your rival, you can use whatever terminology you want, should share your values. And that was implicit in, say, John Kerry's criticism of Russian behavior in Ukraine as 19th century behavior in the 21st century. That's really silly, you know, because it assumes that they are going to be playing by your rules. Why should they? Unless you have the muscle and the will to use it that makes them respect your rules. One mistake. The other mistake I mentioned, I'll reiterate it. Cooperation is based on common interests. It is not favors you do to each other, and therefore you don't have to de-emphasize the competitive part of your relationship, which is real, in order to emphasize the cooperation that is possible.
If I could come in back on the Mekong issue or the riparian issues you mentioned, Bilahari, and the potential to cooperate. You've written about it in South China Morning Post, etc. And you talked about becoming an ASEAN issue. Do I get you right that basically taking it out from just the riparian countries, you think that the rest of ASEAN plus the US, Japan, others need to come in, or how do you see it
Very
unfolding?
simple, all right? I'll put it this way. To me, it is almost axiomatic. When a small country deals with a large country, which is the case in the Mekong region, you should try to broaden the conversation. Because it's not as if Mekong issues are only of concern to Mekong countries. They are of primary concern to Mekong countries, but they are also of concern to us. And when I look at ASEAN as a whole, I think ASEAN as a whole has, for historical reasons mainly, paid much more attention to maritime Southeast Asia than to mainland Southeast Asia, or as I prefer to call it, Mekong Southeast Asia. And if insofar as we have dealt with Mekong issues or the mainland, it's through the lens of functional cooperation, not a strategic lens. It's time we look at the region as a whole. You know, look, if I sit back and think like a Vulcan, completely detached from any earthly cares, I can see some point to Cambodia and Laos. They don't particularly care about the South China Sea. Why should they care? Right? So if we want them to care about issues that are important to them, we should care a bit. I mean, important to us, we should care a bit at least about issues important to them. And I think they are having to rethink their relationship with ASEAN, their relationship with China over these Mekong issues, because it is existential to them. They can't go on in the same way, you know, on these issues. Their own people will not let them.
I think that's a point where certainly you and I agree, though some Cambodian retired ambassadors seem rather upset by your recent comments.
Well, you know, I don't expect them to say anything else. What else can they say?
I
agree with Bilahari. I mean, that's the last you hear of them, you know.
If I could go back a little bit to the thing that's sort of more traditional that Bilahari the way pulled out from South China Sea. What do you think Biden would be advised to do about the South China Sea, Frank? And if I could add one more issue, which no one's really mentioned yet, Taiwan. You know, I think that, in fact, over the last few years, Trump has really been sort of encouraging Taiwan in many ways, to the point where, you know, the Taiwanese administration has been quite, in their own way, quite adventurous. What do you think is going to happen with these two big security issues?
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's a few general rules we could, general approaches we could see the Biden administration taking next year. It's difficult to get the specifics, but look, the first phase for the first 3 to 6 months is simply consultations and visits with friends and allies. That we're trying to reinvigorate the multilateral process. We're trying to develop consultative mechanisms with people who are like-minded on various issues. We're trying to get their take on geopolitical approaches or not, and so you're simply trying to reinvigorate a set of generally positive relationships which have been under stress the last few years. But I would also make sure we're engaging China. I would also make sure the U.S. engages China and tries to emphasize some kind of positive agenda. So we're changing the tone a bit from nothing but criticism. But one of the core geopolitical messages I was into China is the status quo is enormously beneficial to China. There's always an impetus to change it. There's always an impetus to challenge it. There's always an impetus to revise it. Always, always. This is endemic to human nature. But what exists today is enormously beneficial to China, meaning freedom of the seas and Taiwan having this somewhat ambiguous status, but not being independent. So that is, I think, a core truth of geopolitical reality in East Asia. It's not a bad situation, meaning if you try to challenge something because you're not fully satisfied with it, you might end up deteriorating but China's in decent shape now with a less than perfect situation. Regarding Taiwan, I would offer a word of criticism if I made to the United States, at least the current administration, meaning I think doing more with Taiwan makes a lot of sense. There's a lot the US can do with Taiwan. But the big mistake is this: don't articulate or position every initiative with Taiwan vis-a-vis mainland China. Then I think you're actually hurting Taiwan and you're reducing prospects for some kind of outcome, right? But in my view, Taiwan should be in the WHO. In my view, we should look at trade issues with Taiwan. But the point is, you're doing this on the merits. You're doing this on the merits of a sizable economy. You're not doing it because you want to put your finger in China's eye. I think that can reduce Taiwan's security if you do that. So see if we can upgrade relations with China a bit. At the same time, we're trying to improve relations with Taiwan a bit. I don't think it's impossible to do. And I would just take China out of the speeches so that not every single activity the U.S. is undertaking in Asia is done for China, because of China, response to China. But on the merits, the United States should be doing more in East Asia.
Yeah, I think you've got a finger on the problem. The last few years, it seemed that everything was in rest of Asia was a derivative of the main sort of fight against China. The war on China led to all these sub-issues. Bilahari, going back to South China Sea and Taiwan, any wisdoms?
Okay, I think, look, let me start with Taiwan, because I think that's a bit more complicated. What is everybody's interest? Immediate interest is stability in the Taiwan Straits, right? On the other hand, there is no Chinese administration that's ever going to give up at least the goal of reunification. They can't, right? And from time to time, to give some substance to that goal, they will take certain actions. To put things in perspective, yes, the Chinese have been conducting more aggressive air patrols and so on in the Taiwan Straits. But so far, they have not done anything that is even close to what they did in 1995-96, which is shoot missiles over Taiwan, right? So they've also been, careful, right? Now, I don't think there is so everybody wants to maintain stability. We also have to admit that largely for domestic political reasons, there is a tendency in the Taiwanese body politic to get carried away, right? I recall that in the late 1980s, we were very confident that we could get Taiwan into some of the functional UN organizations. Then, of course, Lee Teng-hui came around, Chen Shui-bian came around, and that was that, right? But there is that tendency. I don't think there's any constituency in the US, Frank will correct me if I'm wrong, for abandoning Taiwan, right? Okay, it's just un-American. But there is a very thin line between support for Taiwan and over-encouragement of Taiwan. And it's sometimes very difficult to know where that line lies because it's a shifting line. It's not a static line. For example, I think some of the arms sales that the Trump administration approved for Taiwan were overdue, long overdue, right? That's okay. But then when some of the visits, as Frank said, I mean, that's very wise advice. Just do stuff, don't talk about it. And that's a good way to deal with it. There is a valid debate about whether stability is best maintained by the US maintaining a policy of strategic ambiguity about what it would do to support Taiwan, or whether it is best maintained by a more clear commitment with the parameters defined. That's a valid debate. I have no idea what Mr. Biden will do or what he will finally decide. South China Sea. Well, look, the South China Sea is, in broad strategic terms, a stalemate. Nobody is going to make the Chinese dig up those artificial islands and throw the sand back in the sea. Nobody is going to make them give up their claims, right? On the other hand, they are unable to deter the US and increasingly its friends and allies, from operating in, through, over, under the South China Sea. And that preserves freedom of navigation, not as a favor or a present granted by one great power to another, to us underlings, but as a right enshrined in rules, UNCLOS in particular. And that's not inconsequential, right? So I think if Biden just keeps on doing what Mr. Trump has done, but perhaps at a lower level of temperature, that would be a good thing. Look, what was the mistake in the South China Sea by the Obama administration? And that's where most of the mistakes were made. First of all, in 2012, they brokered a deal between Philippines, a US ally, and China over Scarborough Shoal. China promptly broke it. The US did nothing. 4 years later, 2016, I think, Xi Jinping explicitly promised Obama that it would not militarize the South China Sea. Okay, you can argue about the word militarize, what it really means, but there was a certain commitment, which they promptly broke because by using the Coast Guard instead of the Navy as a kind of fig leaf, and the US did nothing. Now, and when Ash Carter started more aggressive and public phone-ops to challenge Chinese claims, immediately almost metaphysical discussions broke out between the Pentagon, very public discussions between the debates, in fact, arguments, in fact, between the Pentagon and the NSC about whether a phone-op is really a phone-op, and that, of course, undermined the entire effect. Just don't do this kind of stuff. Just keep on doing what you are already doing.
Thank you. We're almost out of time and there are a whole bunch of questions. If I could try my best to simplify it into 3 micro questions. First, do you feel that we are further from the potential of war or conflict between China and America, or edging towards it, especially in the next few months, but even into the Biden administration? Second, since Biden isn't even in office now, could either of you offer a timeline, a kind of things to watch for in the first, say, 12 months? You both mentioned the appointment of the teams, but is there anything else you'd like to see or warn against? And third, I think, is the idea of the Chinese issues, the idea of whether there are ways in which you could see China perhaps responding to Biden, and on Biden's side, what he might have to do differently instead of recognizing China's legitimate interests. And that term, I think, is something that PM Lee has spoken about. And of course, these will be your closing out remarks. So if I've missed something or you want to add something at the last, please do so. Could we start in reverse order, perhaps? Or go back to Frank again. Bilahari always wants Frank to go first. So, Frank, would you mind?
Sure. Let me try all 3. Look, the first one on prospects for war in the near term, I think, is quite remote, quite unlikely. I think it would take a series. If you say the 2 bases for war, either calculation or miscalculation, this would be an extraordinary set of miscalculations on top of other miscalculations. So it would be. So I don't rate that as likelihood. Second is what to watch. Yeah, we talked about look at the cabinet. Second point I look who's visiting where. We'll see that. And the third point I'd mentioned is look at the State of the Union address. But Biden will articulate his national goals at the end of January. His inaugural address might have some of that. State of the Union address will have more of that. So look at those formal national statements about the emphasis he's going to put on foreign policy. And finally, China initiatives, activities. Look, I think U.S. should do some things. I mean, don't stand still vis-a-vis China. I don't think it's a question of accommodating a great power, but I think it's a question of removing irritants, right? And so what I've written on this to say, I think that China and the U.S. should move to undoing the Trump tariffs and the China response from tariffs immediately. These are economically harmful. They just generate ill will. They don't help the U.S. They don't help China. U.S. can just scrap it. Now, that might not be politically easy, but there's ways to dilute it, at least send the right signals to China. And China can respond in kind with that. At least you're getting some positive momentum going in a relationship. So I would look at initiatives such as that. And I would say China should take some initiatives as well. Why can't China support Taiwan membership in the WHO? Why can't China release the 2 Canadians it picked up? It can release them for health reasons. It can say, it has nothing to do with anything. We did just bad health. I mean, the point is China could take some steps too. There's a moment of a reset now with Biden. And I'd say my real fear here is we let the moment slip. There's so much inertia in government. There's so much status quo in government. There's going to be a very loud voice in Beijing saying, we're the ascendant power anyhow. Why should we do anything? America's a declining power. There's going to be a dominant voice perhaps making that case. They let the moment slip. So I hope China can offer some gestures. I hope U.S. can offer some gestures as well.
Thank you, Frank. Bilahari?
Well, on the timeline, what to watch for, I have nothing to add to what Frank has said, and I agree with everything. On war, I think you have to make a distinction. War by design, war as a deliberate act of policy is so improbable, you might as well rule it out, right? For one simple reason, which we often forget in our analysis of US-China relations. They are both nuclear powers. they can both reign mutually assured destruction on each other. So things like the Thucydides trap and all that, it makes for fun reading, but I won't take it too seriously. But I want to spend some time on the last point. I think both sides need to make adjustments, but I think there is a limit to what adjustments both sides can take. If you look at the root cause, the very root cause of many of the complaints of Chinese behavior, whether it is behavior in the South China Sea, whether it is certain trade practices, whether it's certain economic policies, the root cause is something so obvious it is almost invisible to us. And that obvious fact is that China is a communist country. Not in its ideology, but in its political structure. It is a Leninist state led by a vanguard party that claims absolute control over everything, right? And that is the root cause of many things. Take the unfair trade practices. There is no Chinese business that can operate, big or small, and Mr. Jack Ma has just been reminded of that, all right? Without the leave and consent of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party also needs them. So there are special relationships being cultivated at all levels in China. That's how China works. And that special relationships create privilege, privilege which is considered unfair. Some of the mercantilist practices externally in trade, for example, this has the same root. Because what is the overriding interest of a Leninist party? It is always to maintain power. Therefore, and that's a domestic interest. And so domestic interests will always trump any, pardon the pun, any external interest, and that can lead to mercantilist behavior. Now, that means some of the demands that America makes on China cannot be fulfilled. Absolutely cannot be fulfilled. They can be tweaked along the edges, but it cannot be fulfilled. And that is a reality that we have to accept. On the other hand, as Frank said, there are things that China can do. Taking people hostages, this, come on, huh? And you don't have to lose face, as Frank said. You can, there are a whole number of things you can do. You can be a little less brutal in your engagements of the external world. This kind of wolf warrior diplomacy is silly. Look, it takes a lot to alienate Canadians. It takes a lot to alienate Swedes. But when you alienate both at the same time, you are really achieving something that's not easy to achieve. Okay, and they have alienated lots of people around the world. So there are things they can do to ameliorate the situation without changing their core interests.
Thank you, Bilahari. We're going to have you on another time, maybe about China itself. But I think right now we've come to a nice pause about what we see in the Biden administration. I think both Frank and Bilahari have been really thoughtful about the possibilities of the future. They're certainly not people who think that everything will change overnight. Both have cautioned there will be steps to be seen along the way. Look at the team. There were certain parameters relating to the domestic politics and the wide opinion in DC, as well as the real behavior out here in Asia. They've warned ASEAN that while it may relatively gain, it has to prove that it has something to deliver rather than just more meetings. And there's some new issues that they really have to give attention to beyond the South China Sea, things like the Mekong, technology, supply chains, all face that America, in search for results, will look more at other friends and allies in Asia, like the Quad. So certainly, I think we are at a huge change of things. So if I could rely on our two panelists and my friends to give me one more quick answer. Is this a major change for what's going to happen in the region, in the Biden administration coming in?
Look, I'll just jump in. It's not so much Biden and the arrival of Biden. It's that U.S. is redefining and rethinking through its international role simultaneously with China thinking through its international role. And both countries decided that the status quo was not in their best interest. Both countries, just under Trump, we said we're not being treated fairly on the status quo. We have to improve it, and we're going to use friction to change the rules. And China is somewhat saying the same thing. As Bilahari noted, China is guided by an ideology, whereas Trump's U.S. moves came out because of personalities. But this started under Obama. You know, let me define it this way. For about 80 years, U.S. foreign policy was built around the question, do you want to be a minute early or do you want to be a minute late? So for about 80 years, the question, since World War II, the question was, we've got to be a minute early. We've got to invest and manage and lead global architecture for our own security and prosperity, and we're willing to make that investment. Obama said, you know what, we've overshot the mark. And Trump just built on that and said, we've really overshot the mark. I think Biden is much more of a regression to the mean, but the mean, the new moment won't be the same as the traditional moment. So US is still defining its role, and China is defining its role. What does it want from the international system, right? And it's not yet really articulated or seen a stable role. So we have, I think, sort of on incessant pressure or pushes from China for more from within the system, because they don't see a given point of stability. So I see a moment of tension and redefinition where we move to some new equilibrium.
Okay, so dynamics are still moving, even if names and pieces have changed a bit. Bilahari, last word to you.
I absolutely agree with Frank. Look, America bore every burden, paid any price for many, many decades. And they're now asking, why should we? And I agree with Frank that Obama and Trump are different facets of the same phenomenon. Right? The world has changed. So why are we surprised America has changed? It's not going to be a regression to some pre-lapsarian Eden, right? Because the Eden, even the Eden, if there was one, has changed. So we have to live with it. There will be a prolonged period of uncertainty. There will be a long period of tensions between the US and China and other actors. But we have been there before, not exactly in the same way. And if long we keep calm, we know our own interests, we are confident in our own abilities, we can get through this.
Thank you both very much. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope I believe we certainly delivered when I said to you that the two gentlemen would give us real insights and candidly. Thank you both very much, Bilahari, Frank.